Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. Today we're going to be answering a listener question. This one is from a fellow named Nate who says, "Hi Justin, always love your videos. Can you talk about placing plugins pre versus post fader, their pros and cons? Thanks and happy holidays." All right. I told him, that's a great question. I'll make note of it and I'll answer it. So here I am, going to answer it. Before I get into it, briefest of shout outs to this week's sponsors, most important of them being you. How do you sponsor this episode and all the others? By hitting that like button if you're on the YouTube version, making sure you're subscribed here on YouTube or in any of the audio-only formats like Apple Music, Spotify, or any of the others. So make sure you're liked and subbed up, and that's how you sponsor us. Also, big shout out to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days at soundtoys.com. And big thanks to Focusrite, speaking to a lovely Focusrite Claret interface right now. Been using it for ages, hasn't given me a lick of trouble. Been using Focusrite stuff a long time. So big thanks to those guys for being sponsored this as well. All right, now into Nate's question. Talking about placing plugins pre-fader versus post-fader, pros and cons. All right. First off, for those of you who don't know what this means, whenever you are running effects, you can have them running before they hit your fader or after they hit your fader. That's what pre-fader and post-fader means. Usually, where this makes the biggest difference or makes the most sense to think about this is when you're doing sends. Say a send to a reverb. I'll use this example. I know that a lot of people in this day and age, particularly people who are just getting started out, don't always use reverb sends and returns like you're supposed to. You're supposed to use sends and returns. That's the old school wisdom. And there is some wisdom in that. Not just placing your reverb or your delay directly on your vocal track, but rather creating a reverb send that has one reverb that you send everything to, and everything returns back on that channel. There's absolute pros to doing that to begin with. And this is where doing things pre and post fader make the most sense to begin with. So before we get into the pre and post fader question, just got to wrap your head around this if you haven't wrapped your head around it before. I remember when I first learned about aux sends, I was like, this is too complicated. I can't understand it. I think I was like 17 and I was reading a home recording book and I had a 4-track cassette recorder and I was like, you send it from one place to another. How does that even work? But it works is the thing. And the benefits to doing it in this way, where you have a central reverb that you're sending things through, maybe 2 or 3 central reverbs, is that you're using the same kind of reverb across multiple tracks, helping them kind of live in a space together, giving them all some of the same secret sauce to kind of blend them together more properly, more cohesively. Couldn't you do that just by putting a separate reverb on each and every instrument? Yes. However, there's additional setup time to that. And it eats up a lot of processing power. And even with how powerful computers are getting today, there's a big benefit to using one reverb or 2 or 3 instead of like 20 or 50 or 100, and you have to make sure their settings are the same if you want them to be, all of that stuff. I'm not saying don't just plop your reverbs and delays on directly on instrument channels. There's some reasons you may want to do that, just how fast it is, how easy and how fun it can potentially be to just put something on and keep going. But ideally, you've set up these reverbs in advance, so it's really fun and easy and fast to just do a send out to one of them. So now that you've set up things where instead of having a reverb right in your vocal, you have your reverb on an auxiliary channel or a bus that you're sending to, you can send your dry vocal to that reverb either before it hits the fader of that channel or after it hits the fader of that channel. If you send your dry vocal to a reverb before it hits the fader, that means any changes you make on the fader of that vocal before it hits the reverb, they're not going to affect how much vocal you're sending to the reverb. So if you bring your vocal down, the amount of reverb won't go down along with it. And if you bring your vocal up, the amount of reverb won't go up along with it if you're in pre-fader mode. So that means the vast majority of the time, for most traditional effects, you're going to want to run them in post-fader mode. And that's usually going to be the default in most DAWs. It'll default to a post-fader mode. Meaning, if you change the setting on your fader, so you've turned the dry vocal down, well, it's also going to turn the amount of reverb down along with it. Your send is happening after the fader. If you turn your vocal up, the amount of reverb on that vocal is going to go up in proportion along with it, because this is happening post-fader, after the fader. So I would say 80, maybe even 90% of the time, most kinds of effects are going to be run in a post-fader mode, so that the effects scale with the dry sound, so that you get a relationship between wet and dry that works. And as your dry goes up, your wet goes up with it. As your dry goes down, your wet goes down with it. And that's the whole point of post-fader. Pre-fader is more often a special effect kind of thing, where you want to turn down, say, your dry vocal or all of your dry stuff, but the reverb stays there at the same level, kind of hovering there. You have this ghostly, memory of the vocal or the drums or whatever it is still there haunting you as the dry sound goes away. Now, there's one slightly confusing point here, which is when you put a reverb directly onto your vocal track. Yes, that reverb is going on pre-fader because you're putting it on an insert. And inserts, generally speaking, almost always are pre-fader. However, in that context, when you're putting your reverb or your delay or whatever straight on to a vocal track, you're adjusting the wet-dry balance with the wet-dry knob on the reverb or the delay or whatever it is. So even though the effect is technically pre-fader, you've made the determination about what the balance should be inside the plugin itself for that one instrument. So now when you turn up and down the fader, it's turning them both up and down together. It's still keeping your wet-dry balance as is. So that's one slightly confusing thing. When you put it on insert, it's technically pre-fader, but it acts kind of like post-fader. There are other things that often happen post-fader, like a lot of limiters that you'll put on are done post-fader. So if you have like a final limiter that's supposed to be like the last thing in your chain for like a mastering setup or your mix bus, so that if you do some volume rides, those volume rides actually feed into the limiter. So the limiter is helping you prevent clipping even when you turn up the level a little bit. So that's a one rare case where an insert is actually going to be post-fader rather than pre-fader. But most all other effects are going to be pre-fader when you put them on an insert. But like I said, in the case of that reverb example, it can act kind of like post-fader, even though it's technically pre-fader. I know I made everything sound so simple, and then I just confused you and blew your minds, but I hope you can wrap your head around that. Long story short, most of the time when you're running up effect sends and returns, you want to do in post-fader mode, unless you're going for a special effect where you want to be able to have the dry signal go up and down without changing the effect amount. It's rare that you want to do that. The haunting, ghostly reverb being left behind while the dry signal fades out. That is one classic application of that kind of trick. Do you have any favorite tricks for using effects in post-fader mode instead of pre-fader mode, like I suggest you're going to do most of the time? I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Anything major you think I missed, tell me about in the comments down below. If you're on the YouTube version, if you're listening to an audio-only version and you want to send me a message directly, you can email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. Well, I hope that one was useful for you. Hey, do you want something totally for free? I've got something for you. You can check out the 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers, a workshop I've made that really ties together the common threads between the work of all the amazing mixers we've had as guests on this channel, who I've interviewed over the past decade or more, and whose work I've studied. There really are common habits that tie together all of their best work. You can find that, the 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers, at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Hope that one's useful to you, totally free. Big shout out and thanks again to you for hitting that like button if you haven't already, subscribing, giving us the ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all of that stuff. And big thanks to this week's sponsors, Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. If you haven't tried out their stuff, you absolutely should. You can get anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. And also a big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, who made the lovely Claret interface I'm speaking into right now. Great killer bang for the buck stuff there. Thanks to those guys. Thanks to you for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.